Hello and welcome to another opening explorations video. And by viewer request, we have a video on, the viewer requested the Sokolsky opening, which is also called the Polish opening, or even the Orangutang opening. So that opening begins with B4 by White. Now, if we look here on this database, B4 is what? The third, sixth, the ninth choice out of all the possible first opening moves by White. So B4 is known as the Polish opening in this database, but it is also known as the Sokolsky opening, named after a chess master theoretician who wrote a paper on the opening, and it is also known as the orangutan. So this opening, it's been around since the at least the late 1800s. It looks like a lesser known player defeated former world champion Wilhelm Steinitz with the opening before. Let's see, Savielly Tartakower played this opening and defeated Richard Reddy in year 1919. And they were both top level players at that time, in the early 1900s. And so the game was also used by Reddy himself to defeat another master in 1923. And then the game, one of the most famous games, 1924. This opening was played by Tartakower against Giza Maroczy, who is famous for a Maroczy bind in the Sicilian and other opening theory. But in the New York 1924 chess tournament, one of the most famous games with the Polish opening, or Sokolsky, orangutan, whatever you want to call it, it was played in this tournament, and it got the name orangutan because Tartakower, along with all the chess masters, the night before the game, they went to the New York Zoo, and Tartakower apparently was watching an orangutan named Susan, who he consulted with this orangutan in some way. I'm not sure how that was done, but the story goes that he consulted with the orangutan named Susan, and she somehow told Tartakower that he should play B4, and Tartakower also thought that the pawn climbing up the board, this B pawn, reminded him of the way the orangutans climbed dexterously through their cage. All right, on with the Polish opening, Sokolsky opening, and before I continue, one other thing. The Sokolsky name or what this opening is sometimes called the Sokolsky, that was picked because Alexei Pavlovich Sokolsky, who lived from 1908 to 1969, he used it in high-level play, and it looks like he wrote a little review on the opening in 1963, shortly before he died, and the opening was named after him as well. So that there's a little background on why it has so many names. All right, so if you're still hanging in there, let's take a look at this actual opening, which you might want to play if you're tired of normal openings and get bored of seeing the same old thing. So B4. Now, what does this do? Well, it gains space on the queen side immediately. It allows your bishop to fianchetto and aim up here through the center towards the king side. Now, Alexander Alekhine, former world champion, he felt that this opening wasn't the best because it basically showed black what you intended to do right away before you even knew what black's plans are. But anyway, it could be a very good surprise factor if you pick this opening. So the most common move is e5 here. So we'll take a look at that first. And usually moves that are played most often are played most often because they have the most success most of the time. So here, by far, bishop to b2 is played. I mean, you bring this b pawn out, you might as well bring your bishop out. Now you could play a3, that's the second most played move, to just go ahead and defend this b pawn. But why not develop here, attacking a stronger central pawn? And normally, looks like 673 for the number one move versus 300. Normally, there is a capture here. So capture, and then we have a trade. So here there is a trade of a more valuable central pawn for this less valuable flank pawn. And I also, when I did a little research on this opening, I came across that apparently Bobby Fischer has even tried this opening. So if I can find some Bobby Fischer games where he actually played this orangutan or Polish opening, Sokolsky, whatever you want to call it, I'll have to do a video on that and see how Bobby Fischer played this game. All right. So here we have an exchange of pawns. The bishops are in the center, and most often now knight to f6 is played because this pawn is under attack. And so, you don't want this pawn to be captured and then the rook to fall. So knight to f6, you develop a piece taking care of this pawn blocking the attack. And of course, if the knight is captured, the queen would just recapture and develop. And you won't want to give up your bishop pair for this knight. So white normally plays knight to f3 to develop a knight as well. And then we have castling by black. So it looks like black does get to castle fairly quickly here. And now e3 is usually played, followed by d5, and now bishop to e2. And you would play here most likely to avoid a pin on the knight against the queen. So this is a little more passive, the bishop being here. But where else would you go? Because this, if you go to d3, it would block your d pawn. You can't go here, of course. And if you go here, you could be chased away with c6 and maybe have to retreat. So bishop to e2 played most often. And now we have c5, gaining space here in the center, and white normally castles. And then knight to c6, so you push the c pawn and drop the knight in behind it to really help control this d4 square. So now we have bishop to b2, the most played move. So interesting. The bishop drops back here. Maybe where it's safer, and it's under attack by the knight, and you don't want to, unless you have a good reason, usually you don't want to give up your bishop pair. So the bishop drops back. Then we have rook to e8, grabbing the half open file. d3, just keeping the knight out of e4. And then bishop up to a5 here. Knight b to d2, bishop to c7, lining up on the king side. And now what do we have next? And we're getting down to the end here where there aren't many games in this database. So the game could continue like this. C pawn, capture, knight captures, keeping the central pawns here. but then you have b5 attacking. The knight drops back. Then the bishop, fianchettos, firing down through the center and aiming at the king side. And the game continues with a4, b4 grabs space, but does leave a little outpost for the knight here. So rook grabs the half open file, bishop to d6 to protect this pawn under attack. Knight adds more pressure to the pawn, and now we have knight to d7 defending, d4, capture, and the e-pawn captures here. So this is an example of how white could play in this opening. This does leave white with an isolated queen pawn, but when there's an isolated queen pawn position, it opens lines up here. It opens the C file and the E file for the rooks and queen for a possible attack or activity up these open files. And when you still have a lot of pieces in play, then the D pawn, the isolated queen pawn, can be used in an attack. So with isolated queen pawns, black defending against the pawn wants to trade off as many pieces as possible to make this isolated pawn harder to defend as the game goes on. And white, would want to avoid trades and try and get some attack going with these open files and the isolated queen pawn as an anchor point. So let's see here. We'll go back to the beginning and see what other lines and variations might be interesting. So once again, b4. In this database, it's known as the Polish opening, but it's also called the Sokolsky opening after Alexei Sokolsky, a theoretician who wrote about the opening. And it's also called the Orangutang because some chess masters went to the zoo, and Tartakower, a famous chess master, consulted with the orangutan and decided to play b4 here in the opening under the orangutan's direction, apparently. So b4, and we looked at e5. So we could take a quick look at that again to make sure there's nothing else interesting in that opening. You could go with maybe a3 here and defend, but then let's see, we have d5 just grabbing the center. Now you attack here, but it allows the defense of this, and after knight to f3 that is played most often, which you wouldn't want to push forward here because then the bishop will capture this g pawn. So maybe this would be a good surprise opening in some blitz games and rapid games, to throw your opponent off. Maybe it's something that they would probably not see very often. So here, queen to e7 is played most often, creating a battery, helping fortify this pawn because of the double attack of bishop and knight. So now e3 is played, and then knight to f6, getting ready to castle. c4 attacking, and the pawn is defended by your light squared bishop. So c6 fortifies the central pawn. Knight to c3, and an attack here, attacking knight and pawn here. So knight retreats. We have an exchange of pawns here, and the d file is open. And here, the options are to just castle or to play h5 with the idea of immediately getting some kind of attack going on the king side, or grabbing more space on the king side. So another way that white could play this opening. And so this is just an introduction, and I'm not going to dig too deep. So let's go back to the beginning once again and take another look at some of the different options that black has instead of e5. So we have d5, the second most played move. And one reason this opening is called the Polish opening is because there is a similar opening where black plays b5. So let me look at that. I think it's maybe this and this. Okay, yes, the queen's pawn opening, Polish defense. So one reason b4 is called the Polish opening is because there was a queen's pawn Polish defense, which I won't go over this because it's a different opening, but that gives you an idea of why it's called the Polish opening when white plays b4 instead of black playing b4. And does black ever play b5 immediately? It looks like it is possible, and that is called the Polish opening symmetrical variation, where black immediately plays b5. But we are looking at d5 here, the second most played move. Then immediately you play bishop to b2, preventing the e-pawn from grabbing a share of the center. So knight to f6 is normally played. And you could give up your bishop pair and double pawns here, but it's early in the game. You probably still want to keep your bishop pair. So e3 is played, followed by e6. And now if the knight is captured, the queen can recapture and be developed. So here, most played is b5. So interesting continuation. This gains a lot more space on the queen side, prevents the knight from developing. If the c pawn tries to develop, it can be captured, or maybe even the a pawn it could capture. Or, well, let's see what normally happens here. The most common move is c5. So c5, and now you could just capture here, but if you captured en passant by moving the pawn to c6 and capturing this pawn, the knight would just recapture, and you kind of just help this knight develop. So you might as well let this pawn sit here and prevent the knight from developing, and it gives you extra space on the queen side. So white normally plays knight to f3, just starting to develop more pieces. Bishop to d6 here, and black is ready to castle. So white continues with c4, attacking the center with a flank pawn. That is ignored in favor of development. And now we have bishop to e2, getting ready for white to castle. So black normally castles, as does white. And the game would continue with, let's see, b6, maybe getting ready to fianchetto this bishop and fire down towards the king. So d4 is normally played here. But we see that white only wins 14% of the time with this move. So most often played, well, that's if this move is played. So after that, knight to b2, or excuse me, knight at b to d2, queen develops to e7, and the rooks are connected. And I've mentioned this before. One way to tell if your opening has worked out for you is if you can get all your pieces developed off the back rank, your minor pieces, the knights and bishops, and get the queen out somewhere productive and have the rooks connected, and then be able to find good files, open or half open files if those are available for the rook. And if there are no open or half open files, like in this position, then usually you want to put the rooks behind the pawns that have moved forward already, or that you are preparing to push forward. That way the rooks can back them up. So here the game was drawn both of these are 1955 games, so older games. But knight to e5 is one possibility. So something like this. Then the rook just moves to this file where the pawn is pushed forward, and this file could open up because they're, the pawns are confronting each other here. So now we have bishop to f3. And the bishop is doing a little bit more here. The bishop will, basically fight for control of this diagonal if there's an exchange here. And right now, black cannot capture, or the bishop will just be picked off here. So, what do we have next? It looks like rook at f to d8. And black looks good in this position. So now the queen is developed, helping to cover the c pawn. Knight to f8 is played, trying to keep material on the board instead of trading. And now we have g3 and knight to g6. So the game continues. I'll go a little bit further here. The bishops. So it looks like a lot of maneuvering in a closed position. F4. But that's as far as I'm going to go. You can do some further study of this on your own. And that's just another way that the game can go after b4, d5. And then the bishop's still fianchettos here. All right, let's go back to the beginning and look at a few other examples before this video gets too long here. So b4, and then what? We have e5, that was the first choice, then d5, so logical moves where you bring out your central pawns. The third most played move is knight to f6. Now, who might play this move? Maybe somebody who likes a King's Indian defense, or some similar opening as that. Let's see, what the recommendation is here, or what is played most. Bishop to b2. So, as normal, if you're going to play b4, the plan is to fianchetto this bishop. So why not go ahead and do that? And now we have g6 being played most often, getting ready to fianchetto and fight for this diagonal where both bishops will be fianchettoed. So now knight to f3, bishop to g7, c4 gaining more space over here, and now castling. So a type of King's Indian defense set up here. And now e3, which will possibly prepare the push of this d pawn. But it lets the bishop come out here and white can castle. So now we have d6, another King's Indian defense type move here. And this is a normal King's Indian defense setup where now black will have the option to push the e pawn or maybe the c pawn to c5. So how does it continue here? It looks like d4 is played most often. Knight at b to d7, backing up the c pawn or e pawn push. And what do we have here? Bishop to e2 is played most often. And finally e5. Maybe trying to open this e file up a little bit to put the rook here and aim at the king, but the king is ready to castle anyway, and so that's normally what white does, castle. But now we have e4 gaining space in the center and time chasing this knight back. But will this pawn be weak here, especially after the other knight jumps up into the position and other pieces may put pressure on this pawn? So rook to e8 helping fortify the pawn. Knight to c3 adding pressure there. Knight to f8, which unleashes the bishop. And then a4, just gaining more space on the queen side. Then we have h5, gaining space on the king side, and a5. So it looks like white's plan is just to push up on the queen side, gain space, maybe funnel the pieces in there and try and get some activity. So knight at 8 to h7, which helps fortify the king side a little bit more. Maybe this knight will be exchanged and then this knight can jump here in the future. Normally you don't want a knight on the edge of the board, but it really depends on where that knight will go from this point on the edge of the board. So it looks like a6, b6, avoiding opening up the a file for the white rook. And then, let's see, f4. Interesting, grabbing space on the king side. So a capture en passant. Bishop recaptures, now guarding these squares in case the knight wants to jump into the position in the future. And now, let's see, bishop to g4. h3, forcing this bishop to make a decision. And the decision made is to ignore that, play bishop to h6, threatening this pawn capture with check. So, looks like capture, opening up, gaining material here, but we have this, capture with check, rook blocking, so interesting game here. Knight attacks the pinned piece, so bishop captures, Queen adds pressure, threatening to capture and attack the bishop here, capture the bishop. So knight to f3, a counterattack threatening to capture here. What do we have now? That is ignored, kind of. The knight attacks and defends at the same time, so a good move. Whoa, this is interesting. In this game, black won, of course, after the queen captured on e3, which does not look good. But there are just not many options. It looks like the queen will get, kind of trapped here. All right. Anyway, that's another way the game could go where white got in trouble. And what was that? That was b4, knight to f6. So, a lot of interesting ideas in this opening. You might see new and different games that you don't normally play. So, feel free to go and try this Polish opening, Sokolsky opening, or Orangutang, whatever you prefer to call it, and see what you think of it. I'll look at a few more lines here. So let's go back to the beginning. So b4, we looked at e5 and d5. You just grab a central square with your center pawns. Knight to f6, also a good move. And then we have c6, maybe for the fans of the Caro-Kann defense. Here, the recommendation is once again just fianchetto. And now queen to b6, attacking the pawn. And if that pawn ever moves, the bishop could be attacked. So that's an interesting little option there. a3 is usually played to defend. a5 attacks. And then I would think that c4 would be played, but it looks like white wins more often with this move. But then you have capture here, c5. Now, you have to be careful. If you capture this pawn, then possibly you can capture black's b4 pawn, if the queen captures, you have a takes b4 attacking the queen and a discovered attack on the rook here. So that looks pretty serious. So queen to c7 is usually played. And then recapture, rooks exchange, and then what? d6. Just attacking these pawns. So d4 fortifies, knight to f6, knight to f3. And I'll play this out a little bit. Let's see here. The bishop fianchetto's firing down through the center here. Bishop to e2, that common move, which prevents a bishop pin of the knight to the queen. So, excuse me, black's turn. They castle, white castles. And then bishop to g4 anyway. So now that's ignored. Development continues by both sides. h3 puts the question to the bishop. So what should the bishop do here? It looks like normally there's only one game here. And in this game, there was a capture, recapture. d5 limits the scope of this bishop. So then we have b5, threatening to attack. If there's a capture, the knight could capture, attacking the queen. And that looks like it is possible. I was worried about a fork by the queen, but our queen could defend both those pieces. All right. So now we have what? e5 and b6 attacks the queen. Queen jumps up to b8. Bishop to b2, maybe allowing the queen to come over and fight their queen for control of the a file. Rook to e8, helping defend here, preparing to grab this half-open file if there's an exchange. And now queen to a4, grabbing the open a file. So that's ignored in favor of gaining space here on the king side. The rook helps control here. Queen to c8. Queen to b4. So interesting maneuvering here. Knight, wrong one. Knight to h7. Perhaps getting ready to jump down and attack the bishop. So here the rook goes up to the 7th rank, a good strategy. And we have an exchange here. Knight attacks. Bishop to e2, protected by the knight. And knight to f8. Bishop to f1, helping protect the back rank from any surprise rook moves. Knight at f to e6. So putting pressure on this. So knight to e2, queen to b8, grabbing this diagonal. And bishop to c1, and maybe preventing the knight from jumping forward. So we have knight to e4 grabbing the outpost, and bishop to e3 kind of closes this open e file. Now, bishop to f5. So you get the idea. I have to watch out, or I get into these games and maybe drag them on too long. You can study this game on your own if you would like to dig into it further. Back to the beginning, and let me hurry up and just look at a few more, and then we can wrap this video up. So b4, the most common responses by black are bringing the center pawns out 2 squares or developing the knight on the king side. Then you have c6, e6 is another option, which, playing this move, you're still threatening the b4 pawn, but if white fianchettos, now the pawn is not on e5, and you don't have to worry about it being captured. So white, of course, goes here, and you can't capture here, or we'll have a capture of the G pawn, and the rook will be in trouble here. So, be careful with that. If you're playing the black side of this, watch out for this dangerous bishop firing up through the center and aiming at the king side. So you might be able to catch somebody in this opening if they're not familiar with it. And so most often played is this knight move to block the bishop. And then it looks like once again this b5 move. And I think this is what Tartakower mentioned about the orangutan skillfully climbing through the cage, and up the cage. The B pawn is climbing up the board towards his opponent. So D5 is normally played, followed by E3, C5, knight to F3, bishop to D6, C4. And so both sides are just developing now. That bishop to E2 move again, which appears to be a very common place to put this bishop in this opening. So castle, castle, B6 kind of fortifies or solidifies the queen side for the moment. Now we have D4, bishop fianchettos, knight develops, and this looks similar to what we saw earlier with a confrontation going on here with the C and D pawns. The bishop is fianchettoed, aiming at the king side. The queen goes to E7. The knight grabs this outpost here, and the rooks just start developing. So yeah, this looks similar to what we saw. It must have transposed into a similar type of position that we saw earlier in this video. So the queen goes up here, and white has their rooks connected. All right, anything else we need to look at after b4? So the central pawn moves, the knight to f6 move on the king side, c6 or e6, and then maybe this a5 move here. And then what is normally played? Well, normally you don't exchange. Looks like the b5 push again, gaining space on the queen side. And now knight to f6, bishop fianchettos. We have what? d6, e3, g6. Getting ready to fight for the diagonal. D4 kind of blocking or closing that diagonal. Bishop to G7, knight to F3, castle, C4 gains space, and knight at B to D7. Okay, and I'll play this out a little bit further and see how the final piece development plays out. So bishop to E2, E5, knight develops, rook to E8. Finally, white castles, and the first material exchange here, the pawns in the center. So now we have knight to E4, an exchange, rook captures, an attack on the rook. The rook just retreats. So queen and bishop battery created, and the rooks are connected here. So the knight jumps up, further up the board, and also helps defend the king side. Rook at f to e1, and we have a fight on the open e file. So capture, recapture, bishop attacking the knight, threatening to wreck the pawns here. So the knight retreats, queen to f8, maybe preparing to bring the other rook over. And then, let's see, knight to f1, perhaps ready to block the open e file and attack the bishop here. So rook to e8, and instead of blocking with the knight. We have a capture, queen captures, and knight to e3 attacks the bishop. Bishop retreat, and bishop attacks this pawn. But first we have a knight attack here. So queen to e2 to defend, capture, capture. Now white has 2 central pawns versus black's 1, and then this pawn is protected. Queen kind of repositions to a little bit better square, eyeing this f pawn, eyeing the diagonal here. So bishop to h6, putting pressure on this. King up to f2, bishop, bishop to g4. Oh, that's an interesting little move there. So, because if you take that, then the queen will capture here and, then pick this off. So that is played. We have an exchange of queens, bishop captures, and king to f8. So, we've gone into an endgame with bishop pairs on both sides, and it looks like white normally plays what? c5 here to break things up. So capture, capture, and instead of wrecking these pawns and then the bishop could capture the a pawn, we have bishop to g7 here attacking, bishop to d4, capture, capture, and I might as well play this out. We're getting close to the end here. Bishop to e2. Oh, targeting this. But the bishop protects. And now bishop to c4, targeting this pawn. We have a3, h6. The pawns try and get on the opposite colored squares from the bishops, except for this one, which can't, but it's protected. All right, interesting way the game could have gone. So let me do one more check and see if there's anything else interesting here. The only thing I would say with this opening, black has so many options. So, you could probably play this and just get all kinds of different continuations. So we looked at, after b4, the central pawn pushes 2 squares, knight to f6, c6, e6, a5 immediately attacking. Then there's d6 as well. So, I guess we could take a quick look at that. d6, bishop to b2, e5. That just kind of closes the scope of the bishop down here. So e3, knight develops, c4, gaining space on the queen side, bishop to e7, knight up to f3, castle. White is getting ready to castle. Looks like a fianchetto of this bishop over here instead of bringing it down to g4. Knight develops, bishop fianchettos, firing down through the center and aiming at the king side. And now we have castling. And I'm sorry, one of my subscribers, or somebody that just popped up here, it looks like they want to play, and I apologize for not being able to play since I'm in the middle of this video. So yeah, see, now they're really trying to play here. I'm gonna have to apologize to them for not being able to play. So d4, e takes d4, e takes d4, a5, b5. They just keep asking here. All right, well, let's see here. b4, or excuse me, d5 is usually played. Then a4, closing up the queen side, bishop to d6, queen up to b3. And once again, you get the idea. You just develop your pieces out, find out where to put these rooks. Here it looks like there'll be a fight for the open E file once again. After a capture here, we see the isolated queen pawn with white here. So capture, rook to e8, putting pressure on the bishop. Knight jumping forward, targeting this, so the rook defends that. And now, attacking the bishop. We have an exchange. And this game led to a draw, it looks like. After knight to f8, rook, they confront each other on the e file, but knight to e6 is played, blocking and preventing piece trades here. So d5, the isolated queen pawn attacks, but the knight is able to jump onto this outpost. So capture, bishop captures, rook to e1, bishop to d6, knight up to d4, and why would you go there? Maybe that was a mistake in the game because it looks like the knights could capture here. All right, well, let me wrap this up here. I think that'll do it for this introduction. Hopefully that helped you a little bit with this Polish opening, orangutan, Sokolsky opening, whatever you call it. It might be something interesting to try on your own. Feel free to leave comments and let me know what you think, if you're having luck with this opening, if you've ever played it. Also, please like and subscribe to support the channel. And thank you for watching. Have a super chess day.